Hi, my name is Walter Ryce. I'm an arts and entertainment writer at the Monterey County Weekly, and I'm glad to have as my guest painter Warren Chang. Warren was born and raised in Monterey and studied at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, and has worked also extensively in commercial art, but as of 2000 made the switch over to fine art. And I'm glad, Warren, that you've come on the show to talk about your illustrious career.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right. Can you tell us a bit about your upbringing here in Monterey? And
well, I was, unlike, I like to think it's rather unique living here in Monterey that I was actually born here in Monterey. I was born in 1957 in the old Monterey Hospital, which is now across the street from the post office in Monterey. So not in the new community hospital, but the old one, which I think it's the Hartnell Center.
yes.
And so, so I was born here, and my parents are immigrants from Korea. They came here at the advent of the Korean War about the early 1950s, and so that's why I was born here and why we are here today.
And when did you have your first exposure to, or inspiration, or inkling that art was going to be a central part of your life?
Probably from the age of like 4 years old.
Uh-huh.
My father is an amateur artist, and he was always doing some kind of art, whether it was working on woodcuts or painting, watercolor, whatever. He was very, very artistic, and so the idea of doing arts was very acceptable in my family, a very natural thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I gravitated toward that as a little child. And in fact, I remember having great influences even at 5 years old and loving the illustrations and science fiction books. Later on, when I got to be a little older, like 8 and 9 years old, I was crazy about comic books. And I loved, the art in comic books, and it really inspired me. And so I was always sort of drawing, and basically to illustrate it, when I went back to my high school reunion, a fellow student said, "What do you do now?" I said, "I'm an artist." And he goes, "Of course." So everybody remembered me doing art when I was a small child, and that's pretty much, it was, so it was a pretty natural thing. I really didn't have any other interests.
What were you looking for in your arts and art school and your higher education and in furthering your art training? How did you want to direct your art?
At a young age, I think most young people, don't really know exactly what they want to do. So I was like, when I first started, I was a graphic arts major at the Art Center, and basically because of the idea of trying to make a living out of graduating college. So I was really searching for things, trying to hoping that the college itself would give me guidance as far as my career. But what I found is I always gravitated back to the things I really liked, which was, I loved paintings. I loved, as a younger man, I loved, or younger teenager, I loved illustrations, like the works of Norman Rockwell and N.C. Wyeth, the classic illustrators. And so ultimately, that's what I'm kind of doing now, and that's kind of what I was slowly gravitating to when I was in college. But at the same time, I had this one kind of problem, and that problem was, how do you make a living? So I ended up basically sort of doing the kind of work as an illustrator that would afford me a living. So I would work in the style of that was popular of the day and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So after 20 years as an illustrator, I did moved out to New York City. I did lots of advertising illustrations, and in New York City I did many paperback book covers. I like doing the paperback book covers because it afforded me an opportunity to paint more in a more traditional manner, and they gave me long deadlines so I could actually paint in the oil medium. And then, of course, as you mentioned, I eventually segued and transitioned into as a fine artist in about the year 2000. So I've been doing fine art now for the past 12 years, and I think I really found my niche in life as a fine artist. I think I'm a much better fine artist than I was an illustrator.
Interesting. So, what triggered that? What
triggered what?
The switch from commercial art into fine art.
Well, my story is not a very unique one. It's a pretty common story, but about the mid-1990s, everything started to go digital. So in the paperback book industry, for example, it affected all the industries, but in that particular industry, everything was going more photographic, where they would have people do things with Photoshop and that would took over from people, the publishers hiring actual artists, painters, should I say. And so I made a decision at that time that that's not what I wanted to do.
Okay.
I was in New York at the time, and I was hanging out and painting with other artists, and most of them were fine artists, well-known fine artists today. And so we would do, painting all the time from live models and that type of thing. And so it just seemed natural for me. I really wanted to be a real artist rather than do this sort of digital work that was really, the direction that it was going, which it is today. Although, I want to bring up the subject that I did an illustration recently, about 2 years ago, for the first time in 10 years, where Jameson Whiskey approached me. Actually, it was an advertising agency in New York for Jameson Whiskey, Chiat Day. I think it was Chiat. Maybe they got some different name. But they didn't want an illustrator. They wanted someone, they were searching out fine artists to do a 17th century style painting of John Jameson for Jameson Whiskey. And actually that was quite a fun experience, nice return to illustration for a brief time, and I enjoyed doing it.
And that illustration for that print ad, you mentioned in an interview elsewhere that there was some stress involved, and there was also some sort of like weird regard for what you represented to
Well,
the
I
agency.
accepted the commission because I thought, well, they want a fine artist. They offered a sizable amount of money as well, which was a good incentive, but they wanted a fine artist. I thought that was very encouraging, that they wanted real art as opposed to a commercial illustration. But once I started working for them, the kind of pressure they put me under. I mean, for instance, we worked on maybe 6 weeks worth of revisions. One of the revisions was almost impossible, where they wanted, after we had already hired a model to play the main character, John Jameson, they asked that I put the face of the actor that was playing John Jameson on TV into my painting. And I was like, how can I do that, And basically, they just gave me a shot of a screenshot off the TV set of the actor who played John Jameson, and I just had to sort of change the model's face into this other person's face, which was almost impossible in my opinion, without ruining the art. But fortunately, somehow we persevered and just stuck through it, or I persevered, should I say, and they accepted the revision, and everything went fairly smoothly.
Okay.
For instance, they basically I painted the whole picture. With all these revisions, there was a really quick deadline, and they said they wanted the painting in 22 days, which I don't know if you've seen the painting. It's got something like 30 figures in it. 22 days is just not enough time. So I was working pretty much day and night on the painting to complete it. So for me, I feel good about it, but I feel good about it in a way, not because I think it's such a great piece of art, but I feel good about it because I feel like I climbed Mount Everest. I mean, it was such a feat to be able to complete this painting within the conditions that I had to do them.
Yes.
So, but at the end of it all, it ended up being in the subways of New York City, so millions of people have seen it, and they still continue to see it. It's in San Francisco and all kinds of billboards and standees and so on. It's kind of fun to see it out there. Lots of people have come back to me and remarked on the painting.
Okay. Can you describe your fine art style?
As a fine artist, I'm pretty much just a traditional painter, meaning I'm a traditional realist painter. So I don't think there's anything in my style that's really very creative or unique, to be honest. I draw inspiration basically from the old masters, going back to like the 16th century, probably Rembrandt or Velázquez. My subject matter wise, maybe Francois Millet, who painted field workers in the 19th century. So my style of painting is in a way, it's pretty standard. But I think that if I have anything unique going from my art, it's not really the style of my art. It's really the content of my art. It's the ideas behind my art, I think, that make it unique.
Okay. So let's talk about some of the content. You've done a pretty broad series of paintings based on field workers. Why field workers?
That's a good question. That's been asked me many times, and I sometimes have a hard time answering the question. When I segued into fine art from illustration, in illustration I was always being told what to do. It wasn't my own ideas. I always had to basically directed as the subjects that I would paint. And so as a fine artist, I had to come up with my own subjects, and that's probably the big question, especially if you're a realist painter and your paintings are very representational. I sort of just drew back on history, basically. The fact that the field worker is a subject that has been painted for, 600 years, dating back maybe to Bruegel in the 15th century, and then up to 19th century with Francois Millet and Winslow Homer, American artist Winslow Homer painted the cotton field pickers. And so it had that kind of tradition and substance to it. But more than that, I think it really touches into something that I relate to in terms of the human condition, people that are really struggling. I think that struggle for life in life and art goes a little deeper and has more substance, as opposed to, let's say, if I were painting people having coffee or in a shopping mall, for instance. I think that, for me, maybe artists could make that seem really profound, but for me, that's very vapid. But to me, the field workers are really living life, and it's a great metaphor and representative of the human condition, and that's in a more broader sense. So I really find it really fascinating, and I never get bored by the subject.
Was that influence, that particular focus on field workers, influenced by you growing up here near the Salinas Valley, John Steinbeck, which I think a lot of people will relate?
Yes, and the answer to that would be yes, it is, because I did draw with the ambiance of growing up in Monterey and driving around with my family and seeing the farms and just this whole aspect. And John Steinbeck in particular was a big influence, because he was required reading when I was in high school, and I read many of his books, and it just gave a flavor about Monterey that I think I can bring into these paintings because I am from here and I grew up here. Which I'd like to discuss. Like, a lot of my influences are often not just painters. I mean, painters like, Rembrandt and Velázquez are certainly great influences on me, but as equally powerful are the influence of writers like John Steinbeck or Pearl S. Buck, who wrote The Good Earth, or Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. These kinds of literature I draw great inspiration from, as well as other genres of the arts, such as music and filmmaking.
Yes. I thought it was interesting the way you related the way you construct a painting to the way that one of these filmmakers, Sergio Leone, makes a film.
That's true. Well, for one thing, when I started a painting, I come up with a title the same way a filmmaker might come up with a working project for a film that they're making, or a title that maybe a writer might come up with. And I don't know whether this is unusual or not, but that's the way I work. I come up with an actual title first for the painting I'm going to work on. I call them projects. And I think I relate to Sergio Leone in one case, my favorite movie director, because of the extents he would go to produce his films. I think I gave an example, and his latest film his last film before he died was Once Upon a Time in America. And that movie, it was a turn-of-the-century picture where it was turn-of-the-century New York, and he would have a rule that said no blacks only black, brown, or white was allowed in the film.
Yes.
And that captured this sort of nostalgia and sort of period of time so perfectly. And as an observer, as a audience member, we sort of take that for granted, but we don't realize that the filmmaker is really manipulating all of these visuals for us. It's all it's very deliberate as opposed to just accidental. And so I do many of the same kinds of things in my paintings. For instance, I limit my palette. I won't use blue or green in my palette. I mean, the blue or green will be in the painting, but they won't be used with the colors blue and green. And it'll be the color red, for instance, might become very powerful because it's surrounded by a lot of browns and grays. Something that's really borrowed from the old masters, observing the work of the old masters. But there's something about my work is more tonal. It doesn't really emphasize a lot of color like, say, the Impressionists might. And the reason being for it is something I can't really put my finger on, but I think like black and white photography, for instance, it seems to have a lot more power to it than color photography. I don't know why. It just seems more artistic. But, so for the same reasons, when my paintings have less color in it, more tonal, it seems to evoke a mood more, the kind of mood or emotion that I think I'm trying to convey it better serves the kind of the purpose that I'm trying to achieve in the paintings.
Can you talk a bit about the exhibition that you're a part of that's, I think, currently touring China?
Yes, I'm part of a group exhibition in that's touring 7 provinces of China right now. It's a group called acclaimed, which stands for American Chinese Oil Painters League. And it's a group of American artists, supposedly the best American realist artists, and it's only realism. And it started at an exhibition. They had a preview exhibition in New York at the National Arts Club, but now then it opened up in Beijing, China, at the Beijing Art Museum, and it's touring all of China. It's starting from Beijing, and I can't remember the other provinces, but it'll end up, it's a 2-year tour, or at least a year tour, that'll end up in Shanghai. And I think it's just remarkable. It's just a remarkable exhibition, and to have all this, I've never really experienced so many amazing artists that I'll be exhibiting with. It's like the cream of the crop of American artists. I'm very proud to be part of that.
And in particular, realist painters?
All of them are realists, yes. Which in a way I feel that that's part of my responsibilities as an artist, because as a representative of realism, because realism really has not been given the credit or the kind of visibility and that in the last 100 years. And so there's a movement, so to speak, where other artists and some museum institutions, directors, and I mean, it's not, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy or anything, but there's a movement toward that, and things are starting to open up, and I'm very a recipient of that in terms of the beneficiary of that, and I feel a responsibility to be, to some extent, to be a good representative of realism, and which is, to me, is much more than just being a good technical painter, but being able to actually have some kind of expression and meaning in realism.
You incorporate in some of your interiors family members and friends, and there was one in particular in which your son, I believe, is laying on the floor while you're painting, and that one you mentioned was inspired by another painting by...
Well, that particular painting was inspired by a more contemporary artist, rather than someone harkening back. Most of my interiors, I call them biographical interiors, because they're really paintings of myself, a lot of self-portraits, or paintings of my family, or students, or models, and the people basically surrounding my life. I've described them as biographical interiors. And that particular painting was inspired by a painting by a contemporary artist named John Koch, who lived in New York. He died, I think, in like the mid-1960s. But what I find particularly interesting about John Koch is that all of his major works were painted within the confines of his own apartment in New York. So if it's a landscape, it's a scene from his window. So it's all he had a wealth of subject matter to paint just within his own apartment, and following his own life, his wife and his family life. And I found a lot of that was very, very. I think I've drawn a lot of influence from that particular way of going about things.
Yes. And also that particular painting that I just referenced also kind of touches on the balance between your work and your family. And in that case, you kind of incorporated the two.
Yes, and it's I have to say it was manufactured. I mean, certainly, but at the same time, that did happen, should I say. My son is a little older now, where basically my kids will be around my studio and around me as much as they can. Even when I lock the door, they're basically sleeping at the foot of the door or waiting for me to come out. And so that kind of illustrates that kind of relationship. More recently, I finished a painting, a very large figurative painting, about 64 inches, which is large for me. It'll be exhibited down at the California Art Club Gold Medal Show down in actually not Pasadena, it'll be at the USC Fisher Museum. And it's a scene of me at work surrounded by family and friends. And it's a fictional scene. It never happened. It's completely manufactured. I mean, it's a fictional scene. But it just represents to me the people that support me, the people that surrounded me in my life and my art. And a friend once said to me, well, doesn't your family kind of distract your art? And I said, you know what? You're right. My family does get in the way of my art. and my work, but I wouldn't have it any other way. It's a fine balance, and I mean, to me, my priority is to my family more than anything else.
Okay. Can you talk about the two local galleries that are currently representing your work?
You can see my work at two galleries here locally. One at in Carmel at the Winfield Gallery on Dolores, and one in Pacific Grove at the Hawk Fine Art Gallery on Fountain Avenue, which is across the street from Lighthouse Theater.
You spoke a little bit about the how you favor in your paintings content over style, and how that at one time in your career didn't put you in good stead with selling.
Yeah, I have a feeling you drew that question from a previous interview, perhaps. Yes, I think that generally speaking that there's, especially, I think this pertains particularly to a traditional realist like that I am. Mm-hmm. And within traditional realism, most of the art that galleries are looking for are basically the works that will sell, which of course makes a lot of sense. And so as such, a lot of painters, traditional painters, will paint subjects basically that are very, they're very limited. Basically, I can almost name them in one hand. They would be pretty girls, still lifes, and landscapes. Yeah. And I can attest to their logic because even in my own body of work, I'd say 90% of all my still lifes and landscapes have sold. Mm-hmm. Yet, I don't paint them. I don't like to paint them because the things I do like, the things I want to paint, have nothing to do with selling. Selling to me is a byproduct of creating your art, and I have other ambitions with my art. There's other things I want to achieve. So painting field workers and homeless people are not exactly what is going to sell, but it's something I think is important in terms of the statements I'm trying to make. I'm trying to figure out how I'm leading this back to the question, or did I answer the question?
Yeah, I suppose the premise is that the type of painting that you're doing, that you're really interested in doing, are not necessarily the most saleable, but they speak to something that inside you that you want to communicate to other people. And what is that? What is it about the field workers and the homeless people in particular? Those.
Mm-hmm. Well, the homeless people that was done originally for a group exhibition that I had back in 2010 that was traveling the United States. Mm. And the group exhibition was the theme of the exhibition was called Hard Times, an Artist's View, and it was about sort of hearkening back to the Depression era because of the recession that's happening in contemporary times. It was hearkening back to the Depression era of the 1930s, basically similar to the WPA period that was happening at that time. And so it was sort of an update on that. And so being such that I thought the subject of homeless people would be appropriate. And one thing I like about those two homeless paintings that I did that are now touring China is that they are paintings of homeless people here in Monterey County. They look like they could be anywhere USA, that those people could have been in San Francisco or New York, but they're actually people living here in Monterey. So that I find to be interesting, or more unique, that I still paint things that are familiar to me, that's to pertain to our region.
They're local, and yet they've got this universal aspect.
That's true. I mean, the officials in China wanted them exhibited in China, of all places, for reasons I don't quite fully understand, but they wanted these paintings. I guess maybe they wanted to see that America was represented by more than just the cliche, and seeing these homeless people might give the people of China an aspect of America that perhaps they're not used to seeing. I don't know, but I think they're really powerful paintings. I'm really happy I painted them. But again, I doubt anybody wants to have them hanging over their living room. Yeah. Yeah.
Your book, Narrative Paintings, can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, the book came out primarily as a byproduct of having a exhibition. I myself organized my first retrospective, which was at the Pacific Grove Art Center. Mm. And I wanted to have a book published, and I went about sort of investigating it. And through that process of investigating, it grew up into something much bigger than I ever imagined it would, to be basically a monograph coffee table book. Mm. And I found a really wonderful publisher. And
What is that publisher?
Flesk Publications.
Okay.
They're located in San Jose or Santa Cruz, and they're primarily a publisher of comic book artists, comic artists, and fantasy artists. So this was a little bit of a departure for them to publish a fine artist, but he really was interested in my work, and I think it was a good fit. He's also published other fine artists, mainly illustrators, like historical illustrators like Harvey Dunn and James Bama. But more recently, he's doing a catalog of Wayne Thiebaud for the Weizmann Museum. So he's started, branching off and doing other things beyond just comic-related type art. But the quality of his reproductions in his book, the quality of his books are just outstanding. I mean, he uses 4-color reproductions. Is it 4? No, 4-color, of course, but he uses 400 DPI, that's right. Most publishers use 300 DPI, which is the dot pattern,
Yes.
and he only uses 400 DPI, which makes it much smoother and much more, just a better reproduction overall.
Okay. So, what are you working on currently? And
Well, as I mentioned, I had just finished this large figurative work, but right at the very moment, I'm working on a series of a trilogy of fieldworker paintings, and one of them, basically, they were all derived from photographs that I took out in the artichoke fields, which is now that season. And I got permission to go out there, and I took 200 pictures, and it just was like amazing, the pictures that I came up with. By the way, that's one of the ways I get ideas, is sometimes I come up with ideas from scratch and from influence from old masters' paintings, ideas, but in another way that I work is I take photographs, particularly of the field workers, and from the photographs I come up with my ideas. And so these ideas I've developed I'm very inspired by. One is just an artichoke field. Another one is I've titled it Once Upon a Time in Monterey, which is just a scene. I think if you see the concept, you'll get the picture. And the last one I'm working on is kind of interesting. It's influenced by Howard Pyle, a historical American illustrator, often known as the father of American illustration, who was well known for doing paintings of pirates. But there was one painting that he did in particular called Dividing the Treasure, I believe. And it's this long composition of pirates dividing their treasure on a beach.
yes.
And it was something about a scene that I saw out there of these field workers who looked like pirates and gypsies to me, just colorful characters. It was all men, by the way, out there in the artichoke fields, because carrying those sacks are so heavy. Women can't really carry those things, so it's all men. And they were all very colorful with bandanas and long sombreros and just wonderful characters to paint. And they're all seated having lunch. I mean, lots of them, maybe dozens of them, all seated to have lunch. And my mind just went, oh my God, Howard Pyle. So I composed a picture in a thumbnail of a composition I'm planning to do that's basically going to be titled Homage to Pyle, because of the compositional similarity to Howard Pyle's painting of pirates, which I'm very excited to work on.
Okay.
And by the way, I wanted to talk more about my book a bit, but I titled it Narrative Paintings because, the word illustration, which I had made a living 20 years in fine art, is basically not really looked highly upon within the fine art circles. The whole idea that you're doing illustration, and rightly so, because I think illustration, you're painting other people's ideas and you're painting them to make a profit. Something about promoting something. So I can relate to that. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of great art that's been done in illustration, and and my work is very illustrative. Even though it's fine art, it tells a story. It implies some kind of storytelling element. It's narrative. And I deliberately titled it Narrative Paintings because I wanted to sort of own up and identify with that genre, of illustration, in a sense, illustrative painting. And so that's why I deliberately titled it a narrative painting, even though I'm fully aware that the idea of illustration is not well received in the fine art world.
Okay. Warren, I want to thank you for your time.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thanks for coming on the show.